Jerusalem. In a solemn and emotionally charged address, Israel's Prime Minister reflected on the murder of conservative American activist Charlie Kirk, a man he described as not only a friend of Israel, but also a defender of Western civilization and free discourse. The Prime Minister began by acknowledging the brutality of Kirk's death, calling it a moment of deep loss, both personally and politically. He spoke slowly, with pauses that carried the weight of grief and determination. Benjamin Netanyahu said, "Charlie Kirk was a tremendous, tremendous friend of Israel, and he believed and discussed with me how to defend Israel, how to defend Western civilization. He actually wrote a detailed memorandum suggesting how we should do that." He saw our battle as a common one for our common values and our common freedom. In his words, Kirk represented not just an ally, but a symbol of shared struggle, a man committed to defending liberty and the foundations of Western society. Netanyahu said he also believed in having free discourse, and he was, I think, a great American patriot, a believer in the freedom and liberties that America gave to the world, and a believer in the common foundation of our civilization, which he attached to this city, this country, this land. He was struck down. The Prime Minister's tone shifted toward legacy and resilience as he emphasized that Kirk's vision must not die with him. Netanyahu said, "I think the most important thing is to make sure that his legacy isn't struck down, that it continues to live." Now, you know some people are irreplaceable. Charlie was 31 years old. My own brother was 30 years old when he fell in the rescue of hostages in Entebbe. And you know some of these people come once in a century, but it's their legacy that has to live on. He drew a poignant comparison between Kirk and his late brother Yoni Netanyahu, who was killed leading the daring 1976 hostage rescue mission in Entebbe. The message was clear: individuals may fall, but their ideals must endure. The Prime Minister stressed that Israel, along with allies in Washington, would ensure that Kirk's influence would remain alive in the global struggle for freedom. Netanyahu said, "So we're committed. I'm committed, and I know the President Trump is committed, and I'm sure that's true of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to make sure that legacy lives on." The conversation then shifted to the broader issue of threats facing democracies, from extremism and incitement to political violence. The Prime Minister described the global challenge posed by those who exploit the language of democracy while seeking to undermine it. Netanyahu said, "How to address the threats is what you're saying. How do you actually address threats of the poisonous incitement of the people who don't believe in free speech, who believe in the imposition of their views on others, who speak of democracy but actually want to trample democracy into the dust? How to deal with that?" I think it's a common problem. He explained that Israel and the United States are facing parallel battles, both domestically and internationally, as political violence rises. Netanyahu said, "I think the world right now, the Western world, America, Israel, are being challenged by extraordinary violence from political opponents within the countries. Extraordinary violence. President Trump has there's been 2 attempted assassinations at him. One nearly succeeded. I've been targeted myself with death threats, which are pretty much daily. My family is targeted, and so are ministers and public figures. They're harassed. They're threatened in Israel and in America. And this is a challenge to our democracy." He underlined that democracy, at its essence, is supposed to replace violence with peaceful debate. Netanyahu said, "Democracy is supposed to be the non-violent resolution of conflict within a society." Non-violent resolution. The decisions are made not by bullets, but by ballots. And these people increasingly are more and more violent. And the more they speak of democracy, the more they threaten you. They basically say that the greatest danger to democracy is democracy. The remarks grew sharper as he criticized those who see voters as a rabble unworthy of deciding their own futures. Netanyahu said, "You're not going to have the rabble decide. I mean, these people who go to the polls, who are they? We are the enlightened ones. We're raised above that. That's the true democracy. The true democracy is to ensure that there is no democracy." He accused such groups of distorting language, using words in ways that betray their original meaning, and warned that democracies must remain vigilant. Netanyahu said, and there's double talk, there's the use of words that mean entirely different things, and that certainly won't derail us. But I'm sure that we should take all the actions independently and jointly to protect our liberties, our way of life, our democracies. At this point, the discussion turned to the shocking nature of Kirk's assassination, particularly the fact that it was carried out publicly and amplified on social media. A senior US official speaking about the mood in Washington underscored how deeply the killing resonated in the White House. He said, well, a couple points on, I think it's horrifying to see any human being executed before the entire world because of the social media. It was a particularly difficult week this week in the White House and in Washington because Charlie Kirk wasn't just someone who supported the president. He wasn't just someone that we were aware of. He was a personal friend to a lot of people in that White House, the president, the vice president, multiple people. It was a combination, political assassination, but also death in the family type event. He described the event not only as a national tragedy, but also as a deeply personal loss for many in government. The official continued, it was shocking to a lot of people to see. Apart from the tragedy of it for him and for his family and for the nation really is the irony. Charlie was one of the few people out there that was actually engaging what we need more of, and that is debate and conversation among people with strong disagreements. He reminded listeners that Kirk's defining work was encouraging dialogue in environments often hostile to his views. The official said, people know Charlie Kirk because of his role on campuses. He would go on college campuses and he would actively seek out and invite people who strongly disagreed with him to come to the microphone and engage in a back and forth. The alternative to the back and forth is to just attack each other. It's very easy to just do podcasts and just do interviews and give speeches where you attack the other side. It's much harder to engage people whose views are diametrically opposed to yours and engage them in a debate. And he did that. Beyond universities, Kirk carried this philosophy into the digital space, appearing on shows with ideological adversaries and hosting guests he disagreed with. The official said he didn't just do that on college campuses because that's what he was best known for. He did that online as well. Charlie was a frequent guest on the podcasts and on the shows of people who he did not agree with, and he had guests on his show that he did not agree with. He was actually a guest on Gavin Newsom's podcast and engaged in debate with the Young Turks, as well as going around the world engaging in some of these lecture series with people from the other side. It was in this very spirit of open dialogue, he reminded, that Kirk was ultimately killed. The official said, to see someone who was engaged in what we need more of assassinated in the process of doing exactly that, because that's where he was assassinated in the middle of that kind of discourse, I think was an effort not simply to silence Charlie's voice, but I think is an effort to intimidate and silence that kind of effort in America. And I think for the world to engage in that kind of discourse with people you disagree with. He concluded with a stark warning about the dangers of losing civil discourse. The official said, once a society loses the ability of people with strong disagreements to engage in discourse, then the only option you're left with is either silence or violence, neither one of which is acceptable. Both are very destructive. As the remarks closed, the weight of the moment hung heavy. What began as an acknowledgement of one man's brutal death had expanded into a broader reflection on democracy itself, its fragility, its enemies, and the urgent need to preserve it through dialogue rather than division. The assassination of Charlie Kirk was framed not just as the loss of a political activist, but as a symbol of the challenges facing free societies. His legacy, leaders insisted, must live on, not only in Israel or the United States, but as a beacon for every democracy under threat.